What's good, everyone? This is HP Story, and boy do we have a treat for you. What if Madame Pomfrey found Harry had 43 curse injuries and automatically alerted DMLE to Dumbledore? Hit subscribe and the bell, let the story begin. Chapter 1, The 43. The diagnostic scroll finished printing at 12 minutes past midnight. Poppy Pomfrey stood at her workbench in the back room of the hospital wing, the one she kept locked during the school year because it contained equipment too sensitive for curious students to poke at, and she watched the last line of rune text burn itself into the parchment with the particular orange-gold color that meant curse damage, confirmed, non-accidental. She'd seen that color 42 times already in the last 4 minutes. She'd been counting. The 43rd line finished. The scroll stopped. The quill hovering above it, the self-inking diagnostic quill she'd requisitioned from St. Mungo's 15 years ago, trembled once, then went still. Poppy set down her cup of tea. She didn't drink it. She picked up the scroll with both hands and read it from the beginning slowly, the way you reread something when you're hoping the words will have changed since the first time. They hadn't. The scroll was 4 feet long when fully extended, and she had to hold it at arm's length to keep the bottom from dragging on the floor. She read every line, old fractures never treated, set crooked by the body's own attempt to heal. Burns, chemical, not magical, on the palms and 3 fingers of the right hand, scarring consistent with repeated contact with something caustic over a period of years. Repeated blunt force trauma to the skull, dating back as far as age 4. Curse marks from this year alone took up the bottom 18 inches of the scroll, the basilisk venom, treated, but leaving residual magical scarring along the right arm and shoulder, the petrification residue from secondary proximity to the creature, 3 separate instances of dark compulsion magic consistent with a modified imperious variant. And this was the one that stopped her breathing for a full 10 seconds, a faint but unmistakable curse signature in the left shoulder, consistent with what happened when a magical construct tried to possess a living human host and was burned out of it by a counterforce. The boy had faced Voldemort. Again, she had known this, in the way that Hogwarts staff knew things they were not supposed to formally know, whispered in corridors, confirmed by the tight expression on the headmaster's face, filed away under the category of Dumbledore is handling it. She had treated the boy, she had asked no formal questions. She had written nothing in the incident report beyond curse damage, resolved because that was what she always wrote, because Albus always came to her after and said, "Poppy, this must be kept quiet for now," and she always nodded, and the parchment always reflected something vague and non-specific, and Harry Potter always went back to his dormitory, and she always refilled her tea. 21 years she had worked at Hogwarts. She was not a naive woman. She had told herself 1,000 times in 1,000 different versions of this same quiet moment that Albus Dumbledore was the greatest wizard alive and the only reason any of them were standing, and that his judgment was to be trusted even when it was uncomfortable, even when it left a cold feeling behind the sternum that she could never quite name. She picked up her tea again. It had gone cold. 43, she thought. The Hogwarts Medical Charter was not a document most people could have quoted from memory. It was not a document most people knew existed, beyond a vague awareness that the school had some form of student health protocols, the kind of institutional knowledge that accumulated in centuries-old institutions and then calcified into background. But Poppy had read it cover to cover when she first took the post, and she had reread it annually because she was constitutionally incapable of not rereading things, and she knew, with the leaden certainty of someone who has just watched something inevitable arrive, exactly what Article 14, Section 3 contained. She crossed to her record cabinet. The medical charter was in the second drawer, behind the copy of Advanced Magical Diagnostics and the Student Allergy Register. She pulled it out. It was written on vellum that had been spelled stiff sometime in the 16th century, bound in cracked brown leather. She opened it to the page she already knew by heart. Article 14, Section 3. In the event that any enrolled student of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry presents, upon standard diagnostic examination with a cumulative total exceeding 15 curse-inflicted injuries within a single academic year, the attending Mediwitch or Mediwizard is bound by the foundational magic of the school's charter to immediately transmit notification to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Office of Child Protection. This notification is automatic and cannot be withheld, altered, or recalled by the attending staff member, the school headmaster, the board of governors, or any other administrative authority. The attending staff member shall be considered in violation of their healer's oath if they attempt to prevent, delay, or interfere with this transmission in any form. She had known, reading that for the first time 21 years ago, that the automatic transmission was not metaphorical. It was not a suggestion, it was foundational magic, the same ancient, stubborn, categorical type of magic that made Hogwarts's wards function, the same sort of thing that made the Sorting Hat incapable of lying. When the threshold was crossed, the magic moved. It didn't consult anyone. She looked at the diagnostic scroll in her hands, 43. She waited for the feeling of panic that she expected. It didn't come. What came instead was quieter, a loosening somewhere behind her ribs, like a knot she'd been holding tightly for years and had just now been told she was allowed to put down. The notification had already gone. She hadn't stopped it. She couldn't have stopped it. She sat down in her chair, folded the diagnostic scroll carefully and let herself breathe. The Aurors arrived at 4:17 in the morning, not the fumbling, apologetic kind, not the sort who arrived at Hogwarts hat in hand and waited for the headmaster's permission to look anywhere. They came through the Hogwarts gates with a DMLE override key that Amelia Bones had apparently kept in her desk for exactly this situation, 3 senior Aurors and the head of the department herself, and they were in the entrance hall before anyone had thought to wake the headmaster. It was the castle that woke Pomfrey, not the wards, a gentle vibration through the stones of the hospital wing floor, the particular resonance that meant someone authoritative has entered with legitimate purpose, and she was already at the door with her dressing gown over her uniform when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. Amelia Bones was a square-shouldered woman in her late 50s with steel-grey hair cut close to her skull and a monocle that she wore not because she needed it. The vision correction charm had been sorted years ago, but because it gave her somewhere to look when she was thinking, and she needed to look somewhere that wasn't the person she was considering. She was in full DMLE robes despite the hour, and the 3 Aurors behind her were in field kit. She had not, Pomfrey noticed, brought anyone who looked inclined to be diplomatic about this. Madam Pomfrey. Bones's voice was exactly what you'd expect, direct, not unkind, and carrying the firm note of someone who had been reading a very alarming document in a very alarming car and had organized her feelings about it into something useful. I'm told you conducted the end-of-year diagnostic tonight. I did. Pomfrey stepped back and held the door open. Come in. I've kept the scroll. Inside the hospital wing, lit by the soft overnight lamps, the beds were mostly empty. Most students had gone home 2 days ago. There were only 2 remaining patients, both sleeping soundly at the far end. Pomfrey led Bones and her Aurors to the workbench in the back room. The diagnostic scroll was laid out flat on the bench with stones on each corner to keep it from rolling. Bones picked it up. She read it in the same way Pomfrey had from the beginning, slowly, with no expression. One of her Aurors, a younger woman with copper-red hair and a sharp, watchful face, had her notebook out and was moving her eyes between Bones and the scroll. The second Auror, a broad man in his 40s who looked like he'd seen everything and forgiven none of it, stood with his arms folded and looked at the ceiling, which Pomfrey took to mean he was quietly furious. The third was at the door. When Bones reached the bottom, she set the scroll down. How long has he been your patient? She asked. Since his first year, Pomfrey straightened. First incident was November, year 1 troll attack. I treated a fractured wrist and 3 cracked ribs. There were inconsistencies in the presentation even then. The ribs showed prior healing, rough set, no evidence of prior magical treatment. She paused. I didn't ask. Bones looked at her, not with judgment, with the flat, evaluative regard of someone collecting information. And the other incidents, I have records for all of them, my formal records. She moved to the cabinet. And I have the notation in each one. Albus, the headmaster, asked me each time to keep the reports general. For the students' protection, he said, exposure in the press, undue attention. She pulled the file. It was thicker than it should have been for a 12-year-old. I complied each time. You wrote curse damage resolved for a basilisk venom injury. Yes. And before that for a possession attempt injury. Yes, the broad Auror said quietly. Where is the boy now? 2nd floor dormitory. Gryffindor Tower. Pomfrey folded her hands. He doesn't know any of this is happening. Bones placed the scroll in an evidence folder with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, though Pomfrey doubted she had done this specifically before this particular configuration of facts. We'll need to speak with him before we speak with anyone else. Is there a reason he can't be brought here, or shall we go to him? I'll bring him. Pomfrey was already untying her dressing gown, smoothing her uniform. I know the way and he'll take it better from me. Bones nodded once. Don't brief him. Don't tell him what's in the scroll. I need his account first before he knows what we know. Pomfrey paused at the door. Amelia, she said it quietly, and something in her tone made Bones turn. He'll minimize. He does that. He's been doing it since he arrived here. Whatever you ask him, assume whatever he tells you is the smallest possible version of what actually happened. Bones looked at her for a moment, then she said, understood, and turned back to the scroll. The walk to Gryffindor Tower took 6 minutes. Pomfrey had made it hundreds of times in the dark, for 100 different reasons, nightmares, fevers, the particular emergencies that 12-year-olds generated at 3 in the morning. She climbed the stairs without a lamp. She didn't need one. The portraits watched her pass with sleepy curiosity. One of them, a 17th-century knight named Sir Benedict, who had always been a touch overwrought, leaned out of his frame and said something momentous approaches, with great theatrical satisfaction, and Pomfrey said, go back to sleep, Benedict, and he subsided. The fat lady was awake, which meant the castle had been at it, warming the portraits up to the situation. Pomfrey said the password. She kept a register. She was constitutionally incapable of not keeping registers and went through. The common room was empty and dark, orange embers dying in the fireplace. She went up the boys' staircase and knocked on the second-year dormitory door, then opened it without waiting, because waiting in these situations let children hide under blankets and pretend to be asleep. 5 beds. 4 of them occupied by normal, sleeping 12-year-olds. The 5th was Harry Potter, who was already awake, not the groggy, displaced sort of awake, but the alert kind, the kind that suggested he'd woken up at a sound he'd learned to take seriously. He was sitting up in bed with his glasses on. Had he fallen asleep with them on, or reached for them instantly? Watching the door with the careful expression that Pomfrey had noticed every time she treated him, and always told herself was just a personality quirk. Madame Pomfrey, his voice was quiet. He kept it down so he wouldn't wake the others. Of course he did. Get dressed, Mr. Potter, she said, keeping her own voice low. Proper clothes, not robes, come with me. Something moved in his face, a tightening, a readiness, but he didn't ask her what it was about. He just swung his legs out of the bed and reached for his clothes. He was thin. She had noted it every year. She noted it again now, and it made something in her chest do something unpleasant. He was ready in under 2 minutes. No questions in the corridor, no questions on the stairs. She could feel him wanting to ask and not doing it, and she thought about what she'd told Amelia. He minimizes, he makes himself small, and she thought she understood it better now, walking behind him through the quiet castle at 4 in the morning, watching the straightness of his back and the deliberateness of his steps. He had learned that asking questions made him a problem, and problems got dealt with, so he didn't ask. At the hospital wing door, he stopped and looked at her. He could see through the glass that the lights were on and there were people inside. His expression did something complicated. Am I in trouble? He asked. No, she said, and opened the door. The first thing Harry saw was the DMLE robes, and something in his posture shifted, not the flinching that would have suggested fear, but a stillness that was its own kind of defense. He looked at Amelia Bones the way Pomfrey imagined he'd learned to look at adults in authority, cataloguing them, taking their measure, keeping his face neutral. He didn't look like a 12-year-old about to be questioned by the head of a ministry department. He looked like someone who had gotten very good at this. Bones pulled a chair from against the wall, set it a few feet in front of the bench, and gestured to it. Sit down, Harry, I'm Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She sat herself in the chair on the other side and crossed one leg over the other with the air of someone who was going to be here a while and had no issue with that. Do you know why I'm here? Harry sat. He looked at the Aurors, then back at Bones. He looked at Pomfrey. She gave him nothing because she had been told to give him nothing, and because she trusted Amelia Bones. No, he said. I'd like to ask you some questions about this year, Bones said, and about your time at Hogwarts generally. You're not under any obligation to answer, and I want to be clear, you are not in any trouble, none. Do you understand that? A pause. Yes, he said, in the tone of someone who didn't quite believe it but was willing to wait and see. Start at the beginning of the year if you can. What happened to you in September? So he told her, and Pomfrey, standing to the left of the workbench, listened to the smallest possible version of everything unfold. He was good at it, the minimizing. It wasn't dishonest exactly. He didn't leave things out so much as he told them without texture, without weight, without the surrounding context that would have communicated to a listener how bad any of it had actually been. The Chamber of Secrets, we went in to find Ginny. The basilisk, I stabbed it with the sword. Fawkes, the tears fixed the venom. Tom Riddle's diary, it was a dark object, it was controlling Ginny. All of it delivered in the flat, informational register of a boy giving a report, as though he were describing something that had happened to someone else. How did you know to stab the basilisk? Bones asked. I didn't really, the sword was there. The sword of Gryffindor? Yes, and you'd been bitten at that point? Yes, how long before Fawkes arrived after the bite? Harry considered this, a few minutes. I don't know exactly. You were alone in the chamber with a 1,000-year-old basilisk. You'd been bitten by a fang that we've subsequently determined carries a venom that begins systemic failure in roughly 4 minutes, and Tom Riddle was standing there. What were you thinking? Something moved in Harry's eyes. A flash of what might have been dry humor, might have been something older. I was thinking about Ginny mostly. Bones looked at him for a long time. Then she said, before tonight, has anyone from any official body, ministry, Hogwarts administration, the Wisengamot, ever formally asked you about what happened in that chamber? No. Were you told that anyone was investigating it? No. Were you told why no investigation was conducted? No. Bones glanced at the copper-haired Auror who was writing. Then she reached into the evidence folder and produced the diagnostic scroll. She held it but didn't give it to him. Madame Pomfrey ran your standard end-of-year diagnostic tonight. The kind she runs for every student. Are you familiar with how those work? She waves her wand and a scroll comes out, Harry said, more or less. The scroll documents every injury the body has sustained, with a particular focus on curse damage. Healed injuries, partially healed scarring. She looked at the scroll. Yours triggered an automatic notification to my office tonight because it exceeded the threshold specified in the Hogwarts Medical Charter. She glanced up at him. Do you know what that threshold is? He shook his head. 15 curse-inflicted injuries in a single academic year. She unrolled the scroll slightly so he could see the length of it. Yours logged 43. Silence. Harry looked at the scroll. He looked at it for a long time. His face did not do anything dramatic, no sharp intake of breath, no visible distress. But Pomfrey watched the small muscle at his jaw and saw it work once, twice, and understood that somewhere behind that careful composure something was doing something very quiet and very not fine. Right, he said. Harry, Bones's voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more direct. I'm going to read you some of what's on this scroll because I want you to have the information, and because I want you to understand what it means in terms of this investigation. Is that all right? Yes, so she read it. Not all 43 but the significant ones and the pre-Hogwarts entries, and she read them without inflection, in the same clear, even voice she might have used to read a weather report, and that was in its own way the most devastating possible choice because it meant the facts had to stand on their own without the padding of anyone's emotional reaction around them. Blunt trauma to the skull, age 4, age 5, age 6, fractured radius, right arm, age 7, incorrectly set. Burns, chemical, consistent with cleaning agent contact, age 8 through age 10, both palms and fingers. Age 9, compression injury to the ribs, 3 cracked, consistent with repeated confinement in a small space. The copper-haired Aura stopped writing. She looked at Harry, then she looked at the ceiling briefly and looked back at her notebook. Harry was sitting very still. The small space, Bones said, not making it a question. I lived in the cupboard under the stairs, Harry said. Until I got my Hogwarts letter, they gave me Dudley's second bedroom after that. He said it the way he said everything else, flat informational. A fact among facts, the Dursleys aren't magic. They thought if they kept me small enough I wouldn't be. The broad Aura uncrossed his arms. And did anyone at Hogwarts know about your living situation? Bones asked. Harry thought about it, genuinely thought about it, as though it hadn't occurred to him to consider the question before. Dumbledore. He's the one who arranged for me to go back there every summer. He said it was for protection. The blood wards, he paused. He did say that. Did he know about the cupboard? I don't know. He never asked. Another pause. Nobody asked. Pomfrey pressed her hands flat against her thighs and stared at the wall and was extremely grateful that it was not her job at this moment to say anything, because she did not trust what she would have said. I need to ask you one more thing, Bones said, and I want you to think before you answer. If at any point this year or any previous year you had told a member of Hogwarts staff about what was happening to you, the injuries, the chamber, any of it, what do you think would have happened? Harry looked at her. He didn't hesitate. They would have told Dumbledore, and then Dumbledore would have handled it. Bones nodded slowly. She rolled the scroll closed and placed it back in the evidence folder. Okay, I think that's enough for now, she stood. There are going to be some changes in the next few hours that will affect you directly. Before they happen, I want to make sure you hear it from me. You are not going back to the Dursleys this summer. Whatever else happens, that part is not a question. The stillness in Harry's face cracked just slightly, just for a second. Something too fast and too complicated to name. Okay, he said. Where do you want to stay while we sort out the rest? Bones asked. If you have a preference, I'll take it into account. He blinked. It was clear from his expression that no adult in authority had ever asked him where he wanted to stay. He had no practiced answer for this. He looked briefly at Pomfrey and she gave him a small nod. This is a real question, you can answer it, and something in him settled. The Weasleys, he said, if they'll have me, I'll have someone contact them in the morning. Bones looked at the Aura by the door. Get me the Headmaster. Albus Dumbledore arrived in the hospital wing at 5:05, and he looked the way he always looked, ancient, composed, with a particular quality of stillness that had always conveyed to Pomfrey, and to most of the wizarding world, that he was the person most capable of handling whatever was presently happening. He looked at the Aurors, he looked at Amelia Bones, he looked at Harry, who was sitting on the edge of a hospital bed drinking the tea that Pomfrey had made him because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the boy had not eaten or slept and it was 5 in the morning. Amelia, Dumbledore said. His voice was warm, measured, and carried the slight note of someone who is surprised but not alarmed. This is quite unexpected. Albus. Bones had been on her feet for the last 40 minutes, reviewing the pre-Hogwarts section of the file with the copper-haired Aura. She didn't look up from the parchment she was reading. Sit down, please. Something very brief and very controlled moved across Dumbledore's face. He chose the chair across from Bones's workstation and sat, with the ease of a man who had been sitting in rooms full of people looking at him unfavorably for a very long time, and had gotten quite comfortable there. I assume this concerns Harry, he said. It concerns a number of things, Bones said. She set down the parchment and turned to face him. I'll start with the most immediate. Are you aware that the Hogwarts Medical Charter, Article 14, Section 3, mandates automatic DMLE notification when a student presents with more than 15 curse-inflicted injuries in a year? I am, Dumbledore said. Did you know Harry's diagnostic would trigger it? A pause. I suspected it was possible. Did you take any steps to prevent it? The article specifies that such notification cannot be prevented, Dumbledore said, with the measured precision of someone very familiar with the exact wording. I took no steps. Good, said Bones flatly. That means you didn't add obstruction to the list. She picked up the diagnostic scroll. 43 injuries. 18 of them from this year alone. I've been here approximately 45 minutes, and I've already identified at minimum 7 that are directly attributable to incidents that should have triggered mandatory incident reports to this office under existing statute. Not just the medical charter, standard reporting statute. A 12-year-old encountered a basilisk and a Voldemort possession attempt, and my office received no notification. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The situation required discretion. The school's stability is not, Bones said in a voice like a door closing, a consideration that supersedes our legal obligation to report a child being harmed. She set the scroll down. And this isn't only about this year. This goes back to his first year and significantly to before he arrived here. She let that sit. I've spoken to Harry about his living situation prior to Hogwarts. Dumbledore glanced at Harry. Harry met his gaze evenly, holding his teacup in both hands, and said nothing. He lived in a cupboard, Bones said, with documented injuries going back to age 4 that are consistent with chronic physical abuse and confinement. He was placed with the Dursleys by your arrangement. You were aware of his living conditions, at minimum in part. She tilted her head slightly. Were you aware of the cupboard? Dumbledore folded his hands in his lap. I knew the Dursleys were not warm people. You knew, Harry said. The 2 words, spoken quietly without heat, turned every head in the room. Harry was looking at Dumbledore with an expression that Pomfrey had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not hurt, but something more specific and more devastating. The expression of a person identifying something they had long suspected and are now watching confirmed. You knew, and you sent me back every summer anyway, Harry said. The blood wards. The protection was real, Harry, Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice that Pomfrey almost flinched at because it was genuine, the frustrating, impossible genuineness of a person who meant well and had still done harm. Voldemort could not get to me in the cupboard, Harry said. No, he couldn't. He set down his tea. Nobody could. The silence that followed that sentence was the specific silence of a room full of adults who had just had something explained to them by a 12-year-old. Pomfrey looked at the floor. The copper-haired Auror looked at her notebook. The broad Auror had gone very still. Bones broke it. Albus, I need to inform you formally that as of this conversation, the DMLE is opening a dual investigation, one into the welfare history of Harry James Potter and the reporting failures associated with it, and one into the institutional conduct of Hogwarts School under your administration as it pertains to the same. You will be provided with a formal notice of investigation through standard channels within 48 hours. She met his eyes. You will want to contact your solicitor. Dumbledore looked at her. The composed quality of his face had not broken, it had deepened somehow, like a man carrying something he'd known was coming for a long time and had spent that time deciding how to carry it. I see, he said quietly. In the meantime, Harry will not be returning to his aunt and uncle's home this summer. He will be placed in a DMLE-approved temporary arrangement pending the investigation's findings, if you have an objection to that. I do not, Dumbledore said, and again, unforgivably, it was genuine. He looked at Harry and his eyes held something that Pomfrey could only call grief, the particular grief of someone realizing that what they thought was protection had been a cage. Harry, I don't need anything from you right now, Harry said, not cruel, not even angry, just clear with the careful clarity of someone who has decided quietly and absolutely to stop managing other people's feelings about something they did to him. I'm all right. He wasn't. He was 12 and he hadn't slept, and he'd just had 43 injuries read off a list at him like a ledger, and every single thing on the list had happened because the people responsible for him had either done it or allowed it or decided something else was more important. But he was holding which was its own kind of all right, the kind that mattered more. Dumbledore stood. He looked in that moment not like the most powerful wizard alive, but like a very old man who had made choices he could not unmake. I'll contact my solicitor, he said to Bones. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused, half-turned. For what it's worth, Amelia, everything I did I believed necessary. I know you did, Bones said. That's actually the complicated part. Dumbledore left. The door swung shut behind him and the hospital wing felt different in his absence, lighter in a way that was not entirely comfortable, the way rooms feel when something that has been structuring them for a long time is removed. Pomfrey crossed to Harry and sat on the bed beside him. She did not pat his shoulder or ask how he was feeling, because she was a medical professional, and she understood that sometimes the least useful thing in the world was being asked how you were feeling. "Mrs. Weasley," Harry said. "She'll want to come when your people contact the Weasleys. I'll make sure they know," Pomfrey said. Good, he picked up his tea again. It had gone cold too, but he drank it anyway. "I'd like to sleep for a bit if that's all right." "That is absolutely all right," she said. "You can take that bed, I'll stay right here." He lay down. He was asleep in under 2 minutes, glasses still on, the early light beginning to come through the hospital wing windows and fall across the blanket. Pomfrey reached over and gently removed the glasses and folded them on the bedside table. She sat and watched the light change and thought about 21 years and 43 injuries, and a note on a file that said curse damage resolved, and she thought that if there was something like resolution available in all of this, it was going to have to be the kind that was built rather than given. Built was harder. But it was the kind that held. Across the room, Amelia Bones was already drafting the investigation order, her quill moving steadily in the growing light, and outside the windows, somewhere in the direction of the gates, a ministry owl was turning south toward London with the first of what would be a great many letters. Chapter 2, What the Walls Remember. The morning came in sideways, the way summer mornings do at Hogwarts, light through old stone, long and gold, catching the dust that always hung in the hospital wing no matter how many times Pomfrey cleaned it. By 7 o'clock the castle was awake in the way that nearly empty castles are awake. Creak of old timber, murmur of portraits, the distant clatter of house elves in the kitchens preparing a breakfast for a student population that had mostly already gone home. Harry slept through all of it, which Pomfrey took as its own kind of evidence. Children who felt safe slept like that, deep and still, with no flinching at sound. Children who didn't sleep the way Harry usually slept in the hospital wing, surface close and ready to move. She had noted the difference the moment she looked over at 6:15 and saw him genuinely, properly unconscious for what she suspected might be the first time in years. She left him to it. Bones had set up a temporary operations station at the large table near the window, summoning a second chair and a reading lamp from somewhere and spreading parchment across half the surface in an arrangement that looked chaotic but which Pomfrey suspected was highly organized. The copper-haired Auror, whose name was Aura Shafik, Pomfrey had learned, and who had the particular quality of stillness that suggested she noticed absolutely everything and filed it away without comment, was across the table with her notebook, working through the pre-Hogwarts injury record. The broad Aura's name was Williamson. He had stationed himself near the door and had remained there, steady and watchful, for the last 2 hours. He'd accepted a cup of tea at 6 and said thank you with the precise economy of a man who rationed words and meant every one of them. At 7:30, Shafik looked up from the pre-Hogwarts record and said without preamble, "The aunt and uncle." "Are we bringing them in?" "We are," Bones said, without looking up from the investigation order she was drafting, "but not today." "Today I want the school." Shafik nodded and went back to her notebook. Pomfrey refilled her own tea and thought, not for the first time, that Amelia Bones was exactly the sort of person who should have been doing this job all along. The owl from the Weasleys arrived at 8:42. Pomfrey was aware of it before she saw it, because the arrival of a Weasley family owl at Hogwarts always preceded a Weasley family owl at Hogwarts by approximately nothing. By the time the owl landed on the sill, it had already been followed by a second owl, a third, and a handwritten note that had clearly been sent directly behind the first one, because the first one had not contained enough information to satisfy whoever sent it. The first letter was from Arthur Weasley, formal and measured. "We have been contacted by the DMLE. We would like to confirm that Harry is welcome to stay with us for as long as is needed. Please advise on timing and any requirements." The second was from Molly Weasley and was 4 times the length, and contained the phrases that poor boy and I always knew something wasn't right and whatever he needs, we have it, and Pomfrey read it twice because it was enormously comforting in a way she hadn't expected to need this morning. The third was a scrap of parchment with his Harry OK, written on it in what was unmistakably Ron Weasley's handwriting, including the double question mark. She was folding them when Harry appeared at the door of the back room, fully dressed, glasses on, hair in its standard state of architectural chaos. He looked at the owls on the sill with an expression of unguarded warmth that he seemed to catch himself in, like it had gotten out before he'd decided to let it. "Mrs. Weasley wrote," Pomfrey told him. He crossed the room and she handed him Molly's letter. He read it quickly, and whatever happened in his expression was entirely unguarded this time because he wasn't watching himself, and Pomfrey was very deliberately looking at the window. "Right," he said when he'd finished. His voice had done something slightly different. "Right, good." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Bones looked up from her parchment. "There's breakfast coming from the kitchens. Sit down and eat before we start the next part." She said it with the authority of someone who had not become the head of the DMLE by letting the people she needed to be functional skip meals. Harry sat, he ate. And Pomfrey watched him eat like a person who was not entirely sure the food was going to stay, which was a thing she had observed before in children who had grown up uncertain about meals, and she took note of it the way she took note of everything, and filed it in the part of herself that was going to be useful for the investigation rather than the part that wanted to do something immediate and unhelpful about it. When the plates were cleared, Bones said, "I need to talk to you about what happens today. The investigation has 2 tracks. The first is your welfare history, the pre-Hogwarts material, the Dursleys, the placement. The second is the Hogwarts incidents and the reporting failures. Today I want to focus on the second track because the school is here, the evidence is here, and I want to move quickly before anyone decides to start managing the narrative." She looked at him directly. "That means I'm going to be asking the castle questions." Harry blinked. "The castle, Hogwarts has a memory." Bones set down her quill. "Most people know it in vague terms, the portraits, the moving staircases, the way the place seems to react to things. What most people don't know, because it's not published anywhere, is that the founders embedded a specific form of archival magic in the castle's structure. Events of significance that occur within these walls are recorded in the stone. Not everything, it's not surveillance exactly. But anything involving the use of dark magic, significant physical harm to a student, or the deployment of protective or aggressive wards, that leaves an impression. We can access that archive with a DMLE extraction warrant." She held up the parchment she'd been writing on. "Which I now have." Harry looked at the warrant, then at the walls. It was a very particular look, the look of someone reassessing the room they were sitting in. "Is that why the castle feels like it knows things?" he asked. "Partly," Bones said. He looked at the walls for another moment. Then he said quietly, "How many years back does it go? For significant events, all of them." The word "all" landed in the room and stayed there. The extraction took place in the Great Hall, because the Great Hall was the heart of the castle's archival system, the point at which the network of impressions converged, the way all rivers eventually lead to the sea. Bones conducted it herself, standing in the center of the room with the extraction wand she'd brought from the DMLE's evidence vault, while Shaffik and Williamson flanked the hall's entrance. Pomfrey stood to the right with Harry, who watched the whole process with the focused attention of someone learning something and intending to remember it. The extraction wand was a remarkable instrument. It was made from the wood of the castle's original oak door, or so the DMLE archive stated, though Pomfrey wasn't sure whether that was fact or mythology that had been repeated long enough to become official, and it resonated with the castle's own frequency in a way that a normal wand did not. When Bones spoke the incantation in the old, formal Latin that the founders had apparently insisted upon, the response was not subtle. The air in the Great Hall went heavy, then every torch along the walls flared once blue-white and went back to gold. Then the flagstones beneath their feet hummed, a deep resonance that moved up through the soles of the shoes, and the long tables shimmered slightly, like images reflected in disturbed water. And then the hall did something that Pomfrey had never seen it do. It showed them. Not like a pensive, it wasn't immersive, wasn't experiential. It was more like the space between the air had become slightly transparent, like looking through old glass that retained an impression of everything that had passed through it. Moments surfaced. Not in sequence, not labeled, just there in the particular order that the castle deemed significant, which turned out to be more coherent than Pomfrey had expected. The first impression was from the previous evening, the Chamber of Secrets, not the full sequence, not Harry and Ron in the tunnel, not the collapse. The castle showed them the chamber itself, at the moment Harry entered it alone. A 12-year-old boy with a sword he barely knew how to hold, facing a 1,000-year-old dark construct in a cavern beneath the school, and no adult anywhere near him. The second was from the end of first year, the third-floor corridor, the trapdoor. Pomfrey had not known until this moment that Harry had faced Quirrell alone in that chamber. She had treated him afterward and had written curse damage, resolved, and had not asked. She watched the impression, and she thought that the cold feeling behind her sternum from last night had not gone away. It had only been joined by more of itself, until the whole collection of it was pressing on something that she was fairly sure was her conscience. Bones was making notes. She did not speak during the extraction. Shaffik took a parallel set of notes. Williamson watched the impressions with the expression of a man who was building a very specific kind of anger from very specific materials, and would spend it carefully when the time came. The impressions kept coming. Some of them Harry was present for and recognized. He watched the chamber sequence with no visible distress, which was its own kind of terrible thing, the absence of distress where distress would have been appropriate. Others he didn't recognize because the castle's archive included things that had happened in the building's margins, in the corridors and classrooms and off-hours spaces, moments where staff had been present and had said nothing, or had said the wrong thing, or had redirected, or had gone to report to Dumbledore and had been redirected from there into silence. And one which no one had expected, and which stopped the extraction for a full 30 seconds while Bones composed herself, showed a conversation in the Headmaster's office from October of Harry's first year, between Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall. No audio, only the impression of the event, but the castle had recorded the emotional signature with the detail it reserved for significant events. And the signature on Dumbledore's side, during a conversation that appeared to be about Harry's welfare, was not negligence, was not indifference. It was, and Pomfrey recognized it because she had felt it herself, many times, the particular emotional texture of someone doing something they believed was necessary and did not enjoy, which was worse. Which was always worse. Harry was looking at the impression of Dumbledore's office with an expression that Pomfrey couldn't entirely read. Not blank, too many things moving in it for blank. She thought of what he'd said earlier, "You knew and you sent me back anyway." He'd said it without heat. She understood now why there was no heat. Heat required surprise. Harry had not been surprised, he had simply been confirmed. "That's enough," Bones said to the castle, and the impressions faded and the great hall went back to itself. In the quiet that followed, Harry said, "He thought I needed to be kept down so I wouldn't be too much, too early." Bones looked at him. "He thought if I knew what I was, what I could do before I was ready, he thought it would break something. In me or in the plan." He said it without rancor, thinking it through as he spoke, which was a habit of his that Pomfrey had noticed before. "He wasn't wrong about some of it. I'm 12, I don't know what I'm doing half the time." He paused. "But keeping me ignorant and keeping me small are different things, and he did both." Bones said nothing for a moment. "Then you're going to be a very useful witness." "I know," Harry said, in a tone that was not arrogant and not modest, just accurate and slightly tired. The other staff arrived at 9:30, summoned by Bones's formal request through McGonagall, who had apparently been awake since before the Aurors arrived, and who appeared in the hospital wing at 8 sharp in full tartan robes, looking like a woman who had been expecting something like this and had dressed accordingly. McGonagall and Pomfrey had not spoken since the night before. They did not speak now, not in words, but something passed between them in the brief look they exchanged, the complicated, honest look of two women who had both made the same choice for the same insufficient reason for a very long time and were past the point of pretending otherwise. McGonagall sat with Bones for 40 minutes. Pomfrey didn't hear all of it. She stayed with Harry, who was in the hospital wing, reading one of the books from the beside table with a concentration that she suspected was only partly genuine, but she heard enough. McGonagall spoke with the precise, unsparing clarity of someone who had decided, in the small hours of the morning, that the time for institutional loyalty had run out. She talked about the Quirrell incident in first year. She talked about the end-of-year points adjustment, the one that had reversed the House Cup outcome at the final moment, a decision made by the headmaster alone. She talked about her own reports, filed and apparently set aside, about Harry's behavior in classes throughout the year, the pattern of a child performing competence as protection, learning quickly not because he loved it but because being good at it meant less exposure. She talked and Shafik wrote, and at the end of it McGonagall sat very straight in her chair and said, "I should have filed independently. I had the authority to do so. I chose not to because I believed Albus would address things through channels I wasn't privy to." A pause. "That was a professional failure, I want it noted." "It's noted," Bones said. McGonagall looked at her. "What happens to him, Albus? There'll be a formal hearing before the Wisengamot. The specific charges are still being framed, but we're looking at a minimum of 3 counts under the Welfare of Magical Minors Act and 1 under the Reporting Obligations Statute. Possibly more depending on the castle archive evidence." She paused. "He won't face Azkaban in my judgment. But he'll face consequences." McGonagall nodded once. She looked as though she'd been hoping for something slightly different and had decided to accept what was realistic instead. "And the school continues," Bones said. "The students, the curriculum, the building, none of that changes. The administrative structure will be reviewed." She met McGonagall's eyes. "You might want to start thinking about what you'd do if the deputy headmistress role became something different." McGonagall looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about it since approximately 1 in the morning," and stood and left. The other development, the one that no one had anticipated, and which sent the day onto an entirely different trajectory, came from Shafik at 11:30. She came out of the records room off the hospital wing, where Bones had sent her to cross-reference the pre-Hogwarts injury data with ministry intake files, and she was carrying a folder with the controlled expression of someone who has found something significant and is organizing herself before she speaks. "I need to show you something," she said to Bones. Bones was with Harry in the main ward, reviewing a timeline document she'd asked him to help fill in dates, incidents, what he'd been told, who he'd reported to, the texture of each year. He'd done it with the systematic, unhurried thoroughness of someone who had always suspected these details would matter eventually, and had been keeping a quiet record of them in the back of his memory. He stopped when Shafik came in. Shafik looked at him, then at Bones. "He can stay," Bones said. Shafik put the folder on the table. "I was cross-referencing the placement records, Dumbledore's original arrangement that put Harry with the Dursleys." Standard intake procedure requires that the placing authority file a Form 14 with the DMLE's Child Welfare Register, documenting the placement and the welfare basis. She opened the folder. There's no Form 14, meaning the placement was never registered, Bones said, meaning it was never registered. There's no official record, in any ministry file, that Harry Potter was placed with the Dursley family by anyone. As far as the ministry's welfare register is concerned, Harry Potter's post-Voldemort defeat placement is blank. There are no records from the night of October 31st, 1981 to September 1st, 1991 pertaining to his welfare or whereabouts. She looked at Bones. He was just not there officially. Bones looked at the folder. She looked at Harry. Did you know you had no official placement records? Harry turned this over. No, but I don't know what those are. They're the documents that would have allowed any ministry official to know where you were, check on you, investigate complaints. Without them, there was no administrative pathway for anyone to oversee your welfare. Bones's voice had not risen. It remained exactly what it had been all morning, direct, controlled, and carrying underneath it a current of something that Pomfrey recognized as the professional form of fury, the kind that people in positions of authority feel when they realize the systems they are responsible for have been circumvented. This wasn't an oversight. No, said Shafik, it wasn't. Harry said, so for 10 years no one in the ministry officially knew I existed. Officially you were the boy who lived, the symbol, the historical event. Unofficially the child. Bones stopped herself. She pressed both hands flat on the table. Then she said with immense control, no one officially knew you existed. He nodded. He didn't look shattered by this. He looked as though it confirmed a theory he'd held for a long time about the relationship between symbols and people, and how they were not the same thing, and which one the world had been more invested in. What else? Bones asked Shafik. Shafik flipped to the second page of the folder, the original arrest file for Sirius Black. The name landed differently than the others. Harry's head came up. Black was arrested on November 1st, 1981, the morning after the Potters were attacked. He was taken directly to Azkaban. Shafik kept her voice even. Standard procedure for a capital case requires 3 things before imprisonment: an interrogation record, a signed warrant from a ministry official of sufficient grade, and a Weisengamot notation, even a provisional one. She turned the page. There's no interrogation record. There's no Weisengamot notation. She paused. There is a warrant, but it's signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr. under an emergency provision that was declared during the height of the war and was questionably applied, even by the standards of the time. He was never tried, Harry said, not a question. He was never tried, Shafik confirmed. He was never tried, Harry said again, and this time it wasn't confirmation, it was a different process, something being reconstructed from the inside. He's been in Azkaban for 11 years, and he was never tried. Pomfrey did not move. That's a separate matter from the current investigation, Bones said, carefully, watching Harry with the attention she had maintained on him all morning. The careful, evaluative regard of someone who understood that this boy's reactions were not going to be what she expected and needed to be tracked accordingly. It's not separate, Harry said. If Black was set up, if he didn't, he stopped. He's my godfather. Silence. Yes, Bones said, he is. Harry looked at the folder on the table. His hands were flat on his thighs, the same posture Pomfrey had seen on him all morning, the controlled stillness of someone managing a very large internal event. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to open a separate preliminary review into the Black imprisonment, Bones said, today. It won't move as fast as the welfare case. It's more complicated. The Azkaban files are a separate system, but it will move. She looked at him steadily. I want you to understand that these things don't happen overnight. I know, he looked up, but they happen. Yes, Bones said, and something in her tone shifted fractionally, the professional steadiness still there, but with something underneath it that was almost a promise. They happen. The problem arrived at 1 o'clock in the form of Cornelius Fudge. He came with 2 assistants and a personal aura, and he came through the main gate looking like a man who had been woken up by a very alarming memo and had not entirely recovered the thread of his composure. He wore his lime green ministerial bowler hat and the expression of someone who had decided, on the walk from the gate, that the appropriate response to an alarming situation was to be very loudly unconcerned by it. Pomfrey met him in the entrance hall because she was the first member of staff to see him coming through the window, and she did not particularly want him reaching the hospital wing without warning. Cornelius, she said. Poppy, he looked around the entrance hall with the assessing air of a politician reading a room. I've received a rather extraordinary set of memos this morning, something about a DMLE investigation into the school. He said it with the tone of someone who considers the concept inherently absurd. Surely this is a misunderstanding. It isn't, she said. Amelia Bones is here, you'll want to speak to her directly. Yes, I intend to. He took off his bowler hat and turned it in his hands. Poppy, I want to be very clear before I go in there. This school's stability is paramount. The last thing the wizarding world needs is any kind of public disruption regarding Hogwarts, the optics. There's a 12-year-old boy in the hospital wing who has 43 documented curse injuries, Pomfrey said. Fudge blinked. 43, she said again, because she had decided that she would keep saying the number until it had been said enough times to outweigh 11 years of curse damage. Resolved. The legal threshold for mandatory reporting is 15. We are more than double that. The DMLE notification was automatic and cannot be recalled. There is no version of this that does not proceed. Fudge looked at her. He was not, she acknowledged, a stupid man, just a small one, and smallness in power had a way of mistaking its own limitations for strategic complexity. I simply think there may be a way to handle this quietly with appropriate Cornelius. She kept her voice entirely level. Go and speak to Amelia, she is better at explaining this sort of thing than I am. He went. She did not follow him. She went back to the hospital wing, where Harry was standing at the window looking out over the grounds, the folder on the table behind him and Bones's voice carrying through from the records room, where she was apparently already on the internal communication mirror with someone at the ministry. Williamson was at the door, Shafik was at the table writing. Fudge is here, Pomfrey said for Williamson's benefit. Williamson nodded. He didn't move from the door. He simply expanded slightly, the way large, immovable people do when they want to communicate their immovability without doing anything as crass as actually saying it. Harry at the window said, he's going to try to shut it down. He's going to try, Pomfrey agreed, coming to stand beside him. Outside, the grounds were bright and still, the lake catching summer light, the empty Quidditch pitch beyond it gold green and quiet. It was a beautiful day to have a disaster on, she thought. Bones won't let him, Harry said. No, Pomfrey said, she won't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to need a wand. Pomfrey looked at him. I don't have mine on me. He glanced at her. I'm not going to do anything. I just feel better with it. I always think more clearly with it. She understood this, medically and otherwise. I'll get it. She sent a house elf to Gryffindor Tower for his wand and his trunk, because he wasn't sleeping there tonight anyway, and it seemed unnecessarily undignified to make him go back for it. While she waited, she went to the records room and listened briefly through the half-open door. Fudge was mid-sentence. Really must insist that we think carefully about the public implications. Cornelius, Bones's voice. Sit down, a pause. The sound of a chair. I've been doing this job for 9 years, Bones said, in the tone of someone who has decided to be very direct because directness is faster. I have never, in 9 years, received a case file like the one sitting on this table. I have never had a student present with 43 curse injuries. I have never found a 10-year gap in a child's welfare records. I have never found that a person is sitting in Azkaban without a trial. The pause this time was architectural, the pause of someone who is constructing something. And I am telling you right now that if you attempt to interfere with this investigation in any official capacity, if you obstruct, redirect, delay, or attempt to reassign any aspect of it, I will make all 3 of those things public by end of day and you will not survive the political fallout. Am I clear? Silence. Am I clear, Cornelius? Yes, said Fudge in a much smaller voice than he'd entered the room with. Pomfrey stepped back from the door and went back to the window. The house elf brought Harry's wand at 1:30, along with his trunk and an inexplicable stack of toast from the kitchens, which Pomfrey suspected was the castle's own emotional contribution to the proceedings. Harry took his wand and held it for a moment before pocketing it, and it was such a small, specific gesture, a person taking back something that was theirs, that Pomfrey had to look at the window again. Fudge left at 2, not gracefully, and not with what Pomfrey would have called a chastened look on his face, more the look of a man doing a very rapid internal recalculation about where his interests lay. As he passed through the entrance hall, she watched him from the landing, and he did not look up. Bones came out of the records room at 2:15 and sat down with Harry and Pomfrey at the small table by the window. Shafik put fresh parchment on the table. Williamson materialized tea from somewhere. We're moving to the next stage, Bones said. The formal investigation is opened. Fudge won't be obstructing it. He may still try to limit the publicity, but that's a separate fight and he'll lose it. She put her hands flat on the table. Tomorrow morning, I'm bringing in the full investigation team. We'll conduct formal recorded interviews with every current member of staff who had a reporting obligation they may not have fulfilled. We'll complete the castle archive extraction. What we did this morning was preliminary. A full extraction takes most of a day. She looked at Harry. And I need to talk to you about your formal status for the duration of the investigation. Okay, he said. You cannot legally remain in Dumbledore's guardianship while he's the subject of a welfare investigation. That's statute. His solicitor will know this, and so does he. She paused. We have a few options. Emergency DMLE guardianship, which is bureaucratically clean but means a lot of strangers in your daily life. The Weasley arrangement, which they've confirmed they want and which I can approve as an emergency welfare placement today, the paperwork takes about 4 hours. She looked at him. Or there's a third option that I mention because the Black preliminary review has already turned up something. Harry's stillness sharpened. Sirius Black named you as his heir in a document filed with Gringotts in October 1981, Bones said. 1 month before the attack, he also filed on the same date a secondary guardian designation with the DMLE's own records office, not the welfare register, which is why we didn't find it earlier, naming himself as your guardian in the event of your parents' deaths. It was filed correctly, witnessed correctly, and has been sitting in a DMLE records room for 11 years. She let that land. If Black is cleared, and I'm not promising that, I'm saying if that document becomes active. Harry looked at the table. That's a long way off, Bones said. For today, I'm recommending the Weasley placement because I think you need to be somewhere that feels like home and not a proceedings room for a while. She paused. You can say something if you want. Harry looked up. You found a document Dumbledore knew about. I believe so, yes. A document that would have given me a different guardian, a different home, a different everything. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, not falling apart thinking, working through it the way he worked through everything methodically and without flinching. I want the Weasley placement, he said, and I want to be a witness at the hearing, a formal one, whatever that requires. You don't have to decide that now, Bones said. I know, he met her eyes, I want to. Bones looked at him for a long moment, then she said, all right, I'll make it happen. Outside, the afternoon was long and golden, and the castle stood around them the way it always had, old stone, deep roots, every wall holding memories that had been quietly waiting for someone with the right key to come and read them. Pomfrey thought about the impression from the Great Hall extraction, Harry entering the Chamber of Secrets alone at 12 years old, with a sword he barely knew how to hold. She thought about the fact that he had come back out. She had always thought of that as a fact about luck, about Fawkes, about the particular chaos of that night. She was beginning to understand that it was a fact about Harry, about the particular quality of person that a decade in a cupboard, 43 injuries, and a systematic education in being nobody had nonetheless entirely failed to produce. He was 12. He had no idea yet the full scope of what he was, but he was beginning, sitting across a table from the head of the DMLE with his wand in his pocket and Molly Weasley's letter folded against his chest, and the full weight of what had been done to him laid out in a file in front of him. He was beginning to understand that understanding it was his choice to make. And he was choosing, not carefully, not strategically, not because he'd been told to or because someone had explained the value of it. He was choosing because it was the only thing left that was entirely, categorically his. Pomfrey picked up her cold tea, stood, and went to refresh it from the pot. Behind her, Harry said to Bones, tell me what the hearing will look like, so I know what I'm walking into. And Bones told him. Chapter 3, 43 counts. The Wisengamot convened on a Thursday. 3 weeks had passed since the morning Pomfrey ran the diagnostic scroll. 3 weeks of investigation team interviews, of castle archive extractions that ran 18 hours and surfaced things nobody had anticipated, of legal filings and counterfilings, and 2 separate attempts by Fudge's office to reclassify the hearing as a closed administrative review, both of which Bones rejected in writing, in language that left no procedural room for argument. 3 weeks of Harry at the Burrow, sleeping in Ron's room under the sloped ceiling, eating Molly Weasley's cooking, and doing something that Pomfrey, when she visited on the second week to conduct a follow-up diagnostic, could only describe as decompressing, the way a person does when the pressure they've been living inside for years is abruptly removed and the body doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of it. He still woke up early, he still ate quickly, with the focused attention of someone who wasn't certain the meal would last. But he laughed more. He argued with Fred and George about Quidditch with the easy, unself-conscious energy of a person who had discovered that he was allowed to take up space. He helped Molly in the garden without being asked and didn't look surprised when she thanked him, though it had taken him a week to stop looking faintly startled when she did. The night before the hearing, he sat at the Weasley kitchen table with Ron, Hermione, who had flew over, ostensibly to go over dates in their history of magic notes, and actually to make sure Harry was not panicking, and Ginny, who had said almost nothing to Harry in the 3 weeks since the chamber, but who was present in the kitchen anyway, working on a letter at the far end of the table with the particular determination of someone doing something that was not entirely about the letter. Harry had gone over to her at 9, and they had talked quietly for about 15 minutes, and when Pomfrey had left at 9:30, both of them had looked lighter. Molly had packed him new dress robes, because the ones from school were too small, and she had declared the situation an emergency, and taken him to Diagon Alley with the cheerful authority of a woman who understood that clothing was sometimes the most practical form of care. He tried to pay for them. She redirected him so smoothly he barely noticed until he was outside the shop and the robes were in the bag, and she was talking about where to have lunch. He was ready, Pomfrey thought, not in the way that meant he had no nerves and no doubt. in the way that meant he had decided what he was going to do and was going to do it regardless of those things. The Wizengamot chamber was underground, as it always was, circular, tiered, old stone, the particular smell of centuries of formal magic that lingered in the walls the way wood smoke lingers in old wool. By 9 in the morning the public gallery was full, which it had not been for an ordinary session in years. Word had gotten out, as word always got out in the wizarding world, with the speed of something that had been suppressed too long and had finally found a gap. Bones had arranged for Harry to arrive through the DMLE access corridor rather than the main entrance, which meant he walked into the room from the side, at floor level, and the gallery had a clear view of him before the proceedings formally opened. He wore the dark blue robes Molly had bought him, his hair as chaotic as ever because there was nothing short of a structural charm that was going to address that. And he walked into the room with his hands in his pockets and his chin up, and looked at the tiered seats and the gallery and the central chair, and the people assembling on the Wizengamot benches with the expression of someone who has thought carefully about every room they have ever walked into, and has decided that this one does not get to be the one that stops them. Pomfrey was in the gallery with McGonagall. Molly Weasley was 2 rows back with Arthur, who had taken the day off from the ministry for the first time in 6 years. Hermione was beside Ron in the row to the left, clutching a notebook because she had decided that taking comprehensive notes was how she was going to be useful and was going to be extremely useful. Fred and George were in the back row and had, to Pomfrey's considerable surprise, said almost nothing all morning. They were watching their friend walk across the chamber floor, and their faces were doing something complicated and specific that Pomfrey filed away as the expression people wear when they are being forced to revise their understanding of how serious a situation has always been. Dumbledore entered from the main corridor at 9:05. He came without his customary sweeping authority, not diminished, not shuffling, but simply without the quality of inevitability that he usually carried like a second set of robes. He was flanked by his solicitor, a precise grey-haired witch named Marchbanks the Elder, not the one who ran the Wizengamot, and he walked to the respondent's chair in the centre of the chamber floor and sat with his hands folded on his knees and looked out at the assembled Wizengamot benches with the expression of a man who had decided, in his own private hours before this morning, how he was going to face this. He had decided, it appeared, to face it honestly. Pomfrey had not expected that. She wasn't sure it made things better or worse. Fudge entered last, scuttling to his ministerial seat at the top tier with the energy of a man who had been hoping all morning that something would prevent this from happening and had run out of somethings. He settled his bowler hat on his head, looked out at the gallery and the chamber floor, and did something with his face that was attempting to convey that he was in charge of this situation. Nobody in the room appeared to receive the transmission. Madame Longbottom, acting chief warlock in Dumbledore's place, a brisk, straight-backed woman in dark green robes who had clearly been waiting a long time for a morning that gave her this much to work with, brought her gavel down at precisely 9:15. This hearing will come to order. The first 2 hours were procedural, and Pomfrey sat through them with the patience of a medical professional who had learned to wait. Bones presented the investigation summary, the scope of the inquiry, the statutory framework, the 43 injuries, the reporting failures, the pre-Hogwarts welfare gap, the foundational documentation around the guardianship and the unregistered placement. She presented it methodically and without drama, which turned out to be far more effective than drama would have been, because drama could be dismissed as emotion and methodology could not. The castle archive extractions were entered into evidence. The Wizengamot members watched several of the significant impressions on a projected surface, the same large-scale projection method used in major trials. The Chamber of Secrets impression drew a silence from the chamber that was different from ordinary hearing silence, deeper, more personal, carrying the specific quality of a room full of people confronting something they had all been present around in one way or another and had all managed not to see. When the impression of 11-year-old Harry going through the trapdoor alone played across the projected surface, someone in the gallery made a sound that was not quite a word. Molly Weasley had been silent since the hearing started, but her hands, folded in her lap, had gone white at the knuckles. Dumbledore's solicitor made 2 objections during the evidence presentation. Bones answered both of them in the flat, precise language of someone who had prepared for every possible counter-argument and had found them all insufficient. The Wizengamot sustained neither objection. At 11:15, Madame Longbottom said, "The Wizengamot will now hear from witnesses." Bones called Pomfrey first. She had prepared for this. She walked to the witness chair in the center of the chamber floor, took the magical oath of truthfulness, an old charm, one that didn't force truth so much as it made lying physically uncomfortable, a fine distinction that nonetheless mattered, and sat down. Bones asked questions. Pomfrey answered them. She answered all of them, not the careful, institutional, minimum necessary information answers that she had given for 21 years. The full answers with the full context, with every piece of notation she had made in private, and every note she had not made in official records because she had been asked to keep things general. She talked about the first-year troll incident. She talked about the ribs that had healed crooked. She talked about the way she had been told each time that discretion was the appropriate response, and the way she had accepted that instruction and the specific reasoning she had used to accept it. She was precise and she was thorough, and she did not mitigate what she had done by burying it in context, because it had already had enough context placed around it to last a lifetime. When she finished, the chamber was quiet. "One more question," Bones said. "When you ran the diagnostic on the night of June the 17th and the notification fired automatically, did any part of you want to prevent it?" Pomfrey considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. "I think I had been waiting without knowing I was waiting for something to take the decision out of my hands. Because I had proven to myself over 20 years that I was not capable of making it unilaterally." She paused. "I am not proud of that, but it's what's true." She returned to the gallery. McGonagall's hand was on the armrest beside her, close enough to be touching if either of them chose, and neither of them chose, but the proximity was something. McGonagall went next. Then 3 other members of staff, all of whom Bones had interviewed in the 3 weeks prior, and who had all, in their own interviews, said things that were making them now sit in the gallery with the expressions of people reconciling themselves to a reckoning. They gave their accounts. They acknowledged their failures in the specific, unguarded way that people do when they have had 3 weeks to decide whether to be honest and have decided to be. Dumbledore's solicitor cross-examined each one. Briefly, there was very little to gain from pressing any of them harder, and Marchbanks was experienced enough to know it. At 12:30, Bones stood and said, "The Ministry calls Harry James Potter." The gallery went very still. Harry walked from the side bench where he'd been sitting with Shafik, who had appointed herself his unofficial attendant for the morning with the matter-of-fact practicality that characterized everything she did, and crossed the chamber floor to the witness chair. He sat. He took the oath, he looked at the Wisengamot, he looked at the gallery, he found Molly's face and held it for a second, found Ron, who gave him the small nod he would have given before a Quidditch match, "You've got this," delivered with complete and absolute sincerity. Found Pomfrey, who looked back at him and gave him nothing, because nothing was what he needed, because he was not the kind of person who needed bolstering. He looked at Bones. "Ready," he said. Bones began with the early years. His life at the Dursleys, not as a dry recitation of injuries, because they'd already had that, but as an account of actual lived experience. She asked him what he knew at different ages about his parents, what he'd been told, what he'd believed. He answered in the same direct, unhurried way he had answered everything she had ever asked him, truthfully without the minimizing, because he had spent 3 weeks sitting at the Weasley kitchen table in the evenings after dinner learning, slowly and imperfectly and with some difficulty, that telling the full truth was not the same as making yourself weak. He talked about the cupboard. He talked about it specifically, the dimensions of it, what was stored in it beside him, the particular quality of dark and quiet that he had lived in for 10 years, the way he had learned to make himself as small as possible, not just physically but in every other way, because small things were left alone and things that took up space were problems. He did not say this with self-pity. He said it as a person describing their own survival strategy with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who has examined it and understood it and no longer needs to either defend or apologize for it. Somewhere in the second row of the gallery, one of the junior Wisengamot members made a very quiet, very controlled sound that was not quite suppressed quickly enough. "When you arrived at Hogwarts," Bones said, "were you told anything about Voldemort's interest in you?" "Hagrid told me the basics on my birthday," Harry said. "The night he brought my letter, Voldemort killed my parents, he tried to kill me, something made the curse rebound." He paused. "He told me I was famous for it." "Were you told about the prophecy?" "Not until last year." "Were you told about the significance of your mother's sacrifice, the blood protection, the magic that made Voldemort's curse rebound?" "No." "Not until fragments. Gradually, he thought about it. Nobody ever sat me down and explained it. I found things out mostly when they became relevant to whatever was happening to me at the time." "Did you find that appropriate?" He looked at her steadily. "No, but I didn't know it was inappropriate until I started understanding how much I didn't know." He paused. "There's a version of it that makes sense. I was 11, I wasn't ready for all of it at once. But there's also a version where keeping me ignorant wasn't about what I was ready for. It was about keeping me controllable." His voice was even. "Both of those things can be true." Several Wisengamot members glanced at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at the floor. He had been looking at it since Harry started speaking. "In your first year," Bones said, "you faced Professor Quirrell, who was at that point a host for Voldemort, alone in the chamber beneath the 3rd-floor corridor, correct?" "Yes." "Had you been told by any member of staff to go there?" "No, we'd worked out it was happening on our own, me, Ron, and Hermione. We thought someone was going to steal the stone that night and we tried to stop it." "You were 11? "Yes." "And the adults responsible for protecting the stone were not there?" He said it without particular emphasis, just the fact. "We were. What happened in that chamber?" He described it. Without heroics, not the self-deprecating deflection he might have used 3 weeks ago, but also not the heightened retelling of someone performing bravery. He described Quirrell, the attempt to possess him, the burning, the way it felt to have something trying to push through the center of him and being pushed back. He described the afterward, waking up in the hospital wing, Dumbledore there, being told it was over. "What did Dumbledore tell you in that conversation?" Bones asked. "He told me I'd done brilliantly, that my mother's protection had saved me." Harry paused. "He told me some things I didn't understand yet and that he would explain later." "He told me Quirrell was dead." Another pause. "He never explained later." Bones let that sit. She turned slightly toward the Wisengamot benches. "The pattern across both of Harry's years at Hogwarts is consistent. He encounters a direct threat to his life, he addresses it without adult support, he receives commendation and minimal explanation, and the record is filed as resolved." She looked back at Harry. "In your assessment, was Dumbledore trying to harm you?" Harry considered this with the same seriousness he had given every question. "No," he said, "I don't think he was trying to harm me. I think he was trying to protect something that he thought was more important than me in any given moment. I think he's a person who is very good at deciding that the larger pattern justifies the individual cost." He paused. "And I think I was the individual cost." The chamber was very quiet. "I don't hate him for it," Harry said, and this seemed to surprise several people in the room more than anything else he'd said. "Hating him would mean spending energy on someone else's choices. I'd rather spend it on mine." He looked at Dumbledore then, directly, without anger, without softness, with the precise, clear regard of someone who has looked at a situation honestly and decided what it means. "He did what he thought was necessary. It left marks on me that I'm going to be dealing with for a long time. Both of those things are true and they don't cancel each other out." Dumbledore looked up from the floor. For a moment they looked at each other, the old man and the 12-year-old, across the chamber floor, and whatever passed between them was entirely private and entirely legible, and Pomfrey looked at her hands. Marchbanks rose for cross-examination. She was careful. She acknowledged in her opening question that she had enormous respect for Harry's account and was not there to challenge his experience. She then, with the precision of an experienced legal practitioner, attempted to establish that the decisions made on Harry's behalf had been made in the context of an active war, incomplete information, and impossible conditions, and that reasonable people making difficult choices under extraordinary pressure should be evaluated with appropriate context. Harry let her make the argument. He waited for the question. "Do you believe," Marchbanks said, "that a person of Albus Dumbledore's experience and knowledge, faced with what he was faced with, could have genuinely believed his choices were protecting you?" "Yes," Harry said. "Absolutely." Marchbanks made a very small controlled movement that suggested she had expected resistance and had not gotten it. "And does that belief," Harry continued because he had not finished, "change the fact that those choices resulted in 43 documented injuries, 10 years in a cupboard, and a guardianship document that's been sitting in a DMLE filing cabinet since 1981? He paused. "I understand why he made the choices he made. Understanding why something happened doesn't make it not have happened." Marchbanks looked at him for a long moment. She was good enough to know when a line of questioning had ended. No further questions. Bones called one final witness after Harry. Amelia Bones called herself. It was unusual, the head of the DMLE testifying in a case she was prosecuting, but it was not without precedent, and Madame Longbottom allowed it after a brief procedural discussion. Bones sat in the witness chair, took the oath, and addressed the chamber in the direct, unhurried way she had addressed it all morning. She talked about the automatic notification and what it meant institutionally. She talked about the foundational charter and the reason it existed, that the founders had understood 800 years ago that the people with the most authority over children were sometimes the people most likely to normalize harm, and that a system requiring human judgment at every stage was a system that could be influenced by the people with the most to gain from influencing it. She talked about the gap in Harry's welfare records and what it demonstrated about the relationship between institutional power and individual accountability. And then she said, "This is not a hearing about whether Albus Dumbledore is a good man. The evidence does not speak to that question one way or another, and I will not pretend it does. He may be a good man. The question before this body is whether the system of authority he operated within, with his knowledge, his complicity, and at times his active direction, caused measurable, documented harm to a child in his care." She looked at the Wisengamot. "The answer is in the record. The record speaks for itself." She returned to her seat. The Wisengamot deliberated for 40 minutes. The gallery was not cleared during deliberation, which meant Pomfrey sat through 40 minutes of the particular silence that falls in rooms where everyone has an opinion and nobody is saying it. Molly Weasley had been holding Arthur's hand since Harry's testimony ended. Ron was staring at the chamber floor. Hermione was writing something in her notebook, then crossing it out, then writing it again. Fred in the back row said very quietly to George, "I didn't know any of that." "No," George said, "about the cupboard." No, Fred didn't say anything else. Neither did George. They sat with it the way they sat with everything that genuinely mattered to them, quietly and together, and without making it about themselves. Pomfrey looked at Harry, sitting on the side bench with Shafik. He was not performing calm. He was actually calm, in the specific way he got calm when something significant was about to happen, the focused stillness of someone who had done everything they could and was now waiting for the result to be what it was. He had his wand in his hand, turning it slowly in his fingers, and Pomfrey recognized this as the equivalent of what other people did with worry beads or pen clicking. He was not anxious, he was simply present, and the wand was how he stayed that way. She thought about the first time she treated him. November of his first year, the troll attack, a fractured wrist and 3 cracked ribs, and a boy who had said "I'm fine" before she'd even finished the diagnostic, and who had meant it in the specific way that people mean "I'm fine" when they have learned that not being fine is not an option. She had treated the wrist and the ribs, and she had written curse damage, resolved, and she had sent him back to class. She had made that choice 43 times. She was going to have to live with that in the same way she was going to have to live with this morning's testimony, and with the look on McGonagall's face during Harry's account of the cupboard, and with the sound someone in the gallery had made during the impression of an 11-year-old going alone through a trapdoor. The living with it was going to be the work, and the work was going to take longer than this hearing, and that was appropriate. That was exactly what it should cost. Madame Longbottom's gavel came down. The Wizengamot found in favor of the Ministry's case on all presented charges. Dumbledore was censured on 3 counts under the Welfare of Magical Minors Act, the improper placement, the failure to maintain required welfare oversight, and the facilitation of a pattern of inadequate care through institutional authority. He was censured on 2 counts under the Mandatory Reporting Statute for the Chamber of Secrets incident and the Philosopher's Stone incident. He was formally removed as Chief Warlock, a position he had held for 16 years, effective immediately. He retained his Order of Merlin. He was not stripped of his position as Headmaster of Hogwarts pending a Board of Governors review, which Madame Longbottom specified would conclude within 60 days, because the educational welfare of the school's students had to be weighed alongside the administrative consequences, and the Wizengamot was not willing to make that determination without due process. He was not sent to Azkaban. Bones had told Harry 3 weeks ago that she didn't expect that outcome, and Harry had accepted it with the equanimity of someone who had set his expectations to what was realistic rather than what was satisfying. The charges, Bones had explained, required proof of deliberate intent to harm, and the archive evidence, the testimony, all of it, made one thing absolutely clear: Dumbledore had never intended to harm Harry. He had intended to protect something larger, and Harry had been the cost of it, and he had accepted that cost on Harry's behalf without Harry's knowledge or consent. Intent was not the same as outcome. But it was, in law, a distinction that mattered. Fudge attempted from his high seat to add a formal ministry endorsement of the proceedings to the record, a political maneuver so transparent that Madame Longbottom simply looked at him over her spectacles and said, "That's not procedurally appropriate, Cornelius," and moved on. The additional finding, the one that Bones had added to the docket at the start of the hearing's 2nd hour, after spending the previous evening reviewing the complete black file with the DMLE's most experienced records investigator, was read last. The Wizengamot ordered a formal review of the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black, with a preliminary hearing to be scheduled within 90 days. The evidence of procedural failures in the original arrest was sufficient to require it. The outcome of that review was not predetermined. The record was not in Black's favor on its face, but the process would happen. Harry, sitting on the side bench, received this information with complete stillness. Then he let out a breath, slow and deliberate, the kind that ends something. The chamber cleared in stages, the way formal venues always do, the officials first, then the gallery by section, the particular shuffling dispersal of a crowd that has witnessed something significant and isn't quite sure yet what to do with the weight of it. Pomfrey made her way to the floor slowly, letting others pass, watching the patterns. Dumbledore left via the main corridor with Marchbanks at his elbow. At the door he stopped briefly and looked back at the chamber. He did not look at Harry. He looked at the room itself, the tiered seats, the old stone, the chair in the center where he had not sat today, with the expression of a man taking a last look at something he understood, now he would not be returning to in the same capacity. Then he turned and went through the door, and it swung shut behind him, and Pomfrey thought that the room was again lighter in a way that was not entirely comfortable and entirely necessary. Fudge had left quickly with his assistants before the gallery dispersal began. No one appeared to notice or object to this. McGonagall stopped beside Pomfrey on the chamber floor and they stood together for a moment. "She's offered me acting head," McGonagall said, not triumphantly, not with particular feeling, just as a fact to be shared with someone who ought to know it. Bones, pending the board review. "She's putting it to the board tomorrow. You'll take it," Pomfrey said. "Of course I'll take it." A pause. "It will be different." "Yes," Pomfrey said. "It will." McGonagall glanced at her. Something moved in her expression, not the precise, controlled thing she usually showed, but something older and more unguarded. "I should have." "Yes," Pomfrey said. "Me too." They did not need to finish it. They stood for another moment, shoulder to shoulder in the emptying chamber, and then McGonagall said, "I need to speak to Longbottom," and moved, and Pomfrey let her go. She found Harry in the corridor outside the chamber. He was standing with Ron and Hermione. Hermione had her arms around him and was saying something into his shoulder that Pomfrey couldn't hear, and Ron was standing beside them with his hands in his pockets looking in the other direction with the particular expression of a 16-year-old, 12-year-old, Pomfrey corrected herself, though he never entirely seemed it, who is trying to give his best friend space to have a moment, while also making absolutely clear by his proximity that he is still there. When Hermione stepped back, Pomfrey caught Harry's eye over Hermione's head. He gave her a nod, small, direct, and she returned it. Molly Weasley arrived like a weather system, full of purpose and warmth and the particular Weasley talent for making a large group of people feel like a unit, and she swept Harry into an embrace that he accepted with the ease of someone who had, over 3 weeks, learned that this was a thing that happened and was allowed to happen, and did not require him to immediately calculate what it meant. He hugged her back. Bones appeared at Pomfrey's shoulder. "You should know," she said quietly while the Weasleys organized themselves around Harry in the corridor. "The Black Review found something this morning, before the hearing." Pomfrey looked at her. "I couldn't enter it into today's proceedings. It wasn't part of this case and the timeline was too tight. But we pulled the original Azkaban intake record last night and there's a witness statement in it." Bones kept her voice low. "A wizard named Pettigrew, who Crouch's intake notes say was killed by Black in the initial arrest scene, the street explosion. 12 muggles, 1 wizard, Pettigrew. Black's the only one who walked away." She paused. "But the intake record has a problem. Pettigrew's witness designation wasn't just informal. He was listed as a listed secret keeper candidate in the original Fidelius charm record filed at the Ministry at the time of the Potter's concealment." Pomfrey worked through this. "If Pettigrew was the actual secret keeper, then Black couldn't have given away the location," Bones said. "He didn't have the secret to give." She said it with the careful control of someone who had spent the night looking at a very large implication and was not yet willing to run toward it at full speed. "We are still 6 months from a preliminary hearing at minimum, probably longer. The Azkaban Review Board is slower than everything else we do." She looked at Harry across the corridor surrounded by Weasleys. "But I want you to know the direction this is going." Pomfrey thought about the document Bones had found in week 1, the Guardian designation, sitting in a DMLE file for 11 years. She thought about what it would mean for that document to become active. She thought about Harry, who had said he's my godfather in the flat, reconstructing tone of someone understanding what they had been deprived of, and she thought about what he would do with that information if he had it. "Are you going to tell him?" she asked. "Not yet," Bones said. "Not until the direction is certain enough to be something more than a direction." She paused. "He's had enough uncertain things." "He has," Pomfrey agreed. Across the corridor, Harry had extracted himself from Molly with the gentle, practiced ease of someone who had learned to receive affection without being consumed by it, another 3-week development she had noted, and was talking to Shafik, who was handing him a ministry form with the expression of someone completing a bureaucratic task they had found genuinely satisfying. Harry read it, looked up, and said something to Shafik that made her do a thing that Pomfrey thought might be the first unguarded expression she'd seen on the woman's face all week. She was smiling. Harry signed the form. Shafik took it back and banished it with a flick, presumably directly to whatever ministry filing system had been waiting for it, and said something in return, and Harry nodded once in the decisive way he had, and that was that. He walked over to Pomfrey. She studied him the way she always studied people she was responsible for, taking inventory, checking the metrics that mattered. He was still thin, but less so than 3 weeks ago. Molly's cooking had been doing what Molly Weasley's cooking had always done, which was constitute a form of active care that operated through the medium of food. He stood straighter. Not with the performed straightness of someone managing how they appeared, but the natural straightness of a person who had stopped spending energy on making themselves smaller and had found that the energy went elsewhere. "How are you?" she asked. He considered it. "Okay," he said. "Actually okay, not the other kind. I know the difference," she said. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in it, not forgiveness, exactly, because she wasn't sure he'd thought of it in those terms. More the quality of a person who has examined a situation fully, has understood the parts of it that were failure and the parts that were limitation and the parts that were genuine cowardice, and has decided what to do with that understanding. He had, she thought, done this with everything today, with Dumbledore, with the court, with his own history. He processed things into something workable. It was perhaps the most remarkable thing about him, and it had nothing to do with magic. "You ran the diagnostic," he said. "Yes, you could have phrased the records differently before the end of year so the number was under 15. She looked at him steadily. "I know, you didn't." "No," she said, "I didn't." He nodded. Not absolution, just acknowledgement, the recognition that a thing had been done that mattered, and that recognizing it mattered too. Then he put his hands in his pockets and glanced back at the Weasleys and said, "We're going back to the burrow. Molly's making something that I think involves about 16 different kinds of pie." "Good," Pomfrey said. "Eat all of them." He laughed. It was unguarded and real and entirely without qualification. He said, "See you in September," in the tone of someone who has decided that September is going to be something different, and turned, and walked back across the corridor to where his people were waiting. Pomfrey stood in the corridor for a while after the Weasleys rounded the corner, listening to their voices fade down the passage, Molly's warm certainty, the twins' overlapping commentary, Ron's laugh, Harry somewhere in the middle of it, indistinct now, absorbed into the sound. She took the diagnostic scroll from her bag. She'd brought it today as part of the formal evidence submission, and it had been returned to her after proceedings closed because it originated from her files and the copy had been entered into the record. The original was still hers. She looked at the scroll. 4 feet of rune text, orange gold curse marks, 43 lines. She thought about rolling it up and filing it. She thought about the cabinet in the hospital wing and what it contained and the annual rereading and the 21 years of curse damage resolved. She didn't file it. She took out her wand and she transfigured the scroll into something she could carry easily, a small bound volume, spine forward, title on the cover in the official rune script. She looked at the title for a moment, then added in her own hand in the margin the date, June 17, 1993. She put it in her bag. There would be a September. There would be students and diagnostics and fractured Quidditch injuries and badly brewed potion burns, and she would treat them all and file the records and write the notes that had to be written. There would be a Hogwarts without Dumbledore in the Headmaster's office, or with a different Dumbledore in it, one constrained, reviewed, answerable. There would be a Minerva McGonagall understanding what it meant to run a school from a position of actual authority rather than seconded deference. And there would be Harry Potter, coming back in September, who would not be the same boy who had gone through the trapdoor alone, or the same boy who had walked into the chamber with a sword he barely knew how to hold, because those boys had been operating on the limited information they were given and the conviction that no one else was coming. September's Harry would have the same conviction. It was in the bone, she thought, not going anywhere, but he would also know that he had not been wrong to want more than what he'd been given. He would know that the wanting had been correct, and the getting of it had been possible, and that someone had eventually stood up in a hospital wing at midnight and let the foundational magic do what it had been built to do. She walked down the corridor and up the stairs into the pale London afternoon. It was a Thursday in early July. The city was warm and bright and entirely unconcerned with the proceedings of underground chambers and foundational charter magic. People moved past on the street with the particular self-contained energy of city people in summer, and Pomfrey stood on the ministry pavement for a moment, adjusting to the brightness. Her bag was in her hand. The small bound volume with the date in the margin was in her bag. The rune script on the spine read what it always had read, what it had been called in the official language of the magical examination that had simply, accurately been doing its job. 43. She walked to the apparition point and went home.